working our way through the writings. We've looked at Psalms, we've looked at Proverbs, and now Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of the stranger books in the Bible. It's always kind of been a hard book for me, to be honest, and I think it's one of the more difficult books in the entire Old Testament for sure. And I'm not alone historically, actually. There have been a lot of debates over Ecclesiastes, and you'll often have people you wouldn't expect liking it, like secular people, and people you wouldn't expect struggling over it. One author's written, "There's no spiritual uplift embodied within these pages. Ecclesiastes accomplishes only one thing, confusion." Another man notes that many contemporary Christians agree. Even today, many read the book with the indistinct feeling that it does not belong in the Bible. I don't really trust anyone who says that they can't see why it's a strange book. And yet I think it's also a really relevant book and an important book for helping us live a life that makes sense, that's good for us, and that honors God. It does all kinds of things for us. It asks the big questions. It looks life square in the face without really flinching. It gives us a realistic view of the damage done by the fall and the resulting vanity of life. It shows us the way to enjoy the good things of life while revealing the frustration that comes from sin and death. And ultimately, it shows us how to live a life that has any meaning by calling on us to live our lives fearing God. So Ecclesiastes is maybe a strange book, but it's definitely an important book. It's in the Bible for a reason. It's classified in the Old Testament as part of the wisdom literature. That's its, you might say, genre. Wisdom's the skill, we've said, of godly living. It's knowing what to say when you should say it, what to feel when you should feel it, what to do when you should do it. It's looking at life in this world, how it works, and trying to figure out what it's all about and how to live life really well. And there are 4 books in the Old Testament specifically designed to give us this wisdom: Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes in particular are important to consider together because they combine to give us all sorts of different angles, perspectives on very similar issues. And it's kind of like all of those perspectives are necessary to really understand how life in this world works. If you just had Job, it might not be quite enough. If you just had Proverbs, you would get a certain perspective that would miss out on some of what Ecclesiastes had to say. You need them all together. Obviously, we looked at Proverbs the last couple times we were together, and Proverbs in many ways is just looking at the specifics of life and saying, this is what works well, this is what doesn't work well. And it's a fairly positive book overall. It sees order. It sees that there is blessing in doing what God says we should do. Where Ecclesiastes takes a step back and looks at life as a whole, and it grapples more thoroughly with some of the difficulties that we face in this life as a result of the fall. So Proverbs is like, do this and do that, and Ecclesiastes is like, wait, but why? Now, the word Ecclesiastes is not one that we use often or at all, so this is a strange title for a strange book, I suppose. But it comes from that Greek version of the Old Testament that we call the Septuagint, and the term refers to one who addresses the assembly of the citizens. The Greek word ecclesia is the word for church. It's an assembly, and Ecclesiastes was one who addressed the ecclesia, which is like a picture of what's going on. Someone is addressing a group of people. They say that word is closely connected to the Hebrew word koheleth. So if you look at verse 1 of Ecclesiastes, it says, the words of the preacher, and preacher is the Hebrew word koheleth, which is a good enough description of the book, I guess, as these are the words of someone who's addressing a group of people in order to give them wisdom about how life in God's world works. He's not really a preacher so much as he is a sage. He's someone who has wisdom, and he wants to give you that wisdom, but, he's going to make you work for it. You're going to have to think. One of the big background questions to the book has specifically to do with who wrote it. Who is this preacher? As we said, the book opens the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, which is an introduction to the author, whom traditionally people have identified as Solomon because of the wisdom, because of some of the things he says about himself, like, for example, how prosperous he was. And more recently, a lot of people have made arguments against Solomonic authorship, but I don't see any reason to think Solomon didn't write it. As someone has explained, no other king in all Israel's history fits the factors of wisdom, works, and wealth better than Solomon. And, people nowadays may not think it was Solomon who wrote it, but we're living pretty long after this book was written. And traditionally, it's been identified as having been written by Solomon, and that makes sense. This is Solomon's book, though perhaps we can give this a little more nuance, and for me this actually helps. Because looking at the way this book opens here in 1:1 and the way it ends in chapter 12:9 and following, it's like there's a framing to the book, an introduction and a conclusion with the meat of the book in between. And when you look at the introduction and the conclusion, there seems to be an additional character. Now, this could just be another device of Solomon. He's really wise. He's a good writer. Or it could be that there is actually another author. It's like a two-author book. Solomon, and most of it's his words, 1:2 through 12:8, and then someone we might describe as the narrator. Now, I tend to think it's probably just more of a writing style. But you can see with even the way this first verse reads, it sort of sounds like the words of someone who compiled the words of the preacher, since it's third person, the words of the preacher. And then verse 2, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, still third person. And then once we're into the book, verse 12, it says, I, the preacher. So there's this third person who compiled the preacher's words, and then the preacher starts talking. And then if you listen to the way the book ends in chapter 12, verse 9 and following, it's like the narrator is back on the scene, and he offers up his summary or evaluation of what the preacher says. He writes, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. And so it seems kind of like he's talking to his son after having gathered together all the words of the preacher, and he's making clear those words are from God, and he wants to help his son at the end process what he's heard by finishing up the end of the matter. All's been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. Which, whether it's a writing style of Solomon or an actual narrator who did this, helps me understand what's happening in Ecclesiastes. Because it's like the narrator wants to think things through with his son, specifically in regards to the question, what is the meaning of life? And he uses Solomon's Proverbs to help him do that. It's almost like he's working through this big experiment. Let's test life. Let's see if we can find its meaning. And then after presenting the preacher's argument, the narrator says, okay, let's just make sure we get this right. This is the end. This is the conclusion of everything we've read. Fear God and keep his commandments. Which sounds kind of simple, but the book is anything but simplistic. In fact, there are some real challenges to understanding this book, like the fact that he says some things that almost seem wrong. And as a result, some people think that Solomon, the author, it's like he's lost faith in God when he writes. And they pick verses to support that, like chapter 3, verse 3. There's a time to kill. There's a time to break down. It's very, very cynical. Chapter 7, verse 16. He says, be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. That doesn't sound like someone who really is loving the law. That doesn't sound like something they would write. Or chapter 9, verse 2. It's the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and to the evil. But I think there are too many obvious, faith-filled statements throughout the book to think that, even about the importance of fearing God. I found the importance of fearing God something like 5 or 6 times in Ecclesiastes. And so I don't think this is just a bunch of skeptical kinds of statements. I think those statements are actually intended to make you think again. Others think that what's happening is that Solomon is just struggling with life in light of death, and he's looking at life in this world, and almost throughout the book, he's talking to himself. He's struggling between doubts and faith, with faith winning out. I'm not as sure about this view, really, but one of my favorite commentators on the wisdom books actually takes this perspective. He writes, "I read this book as an agonizing struggle of an honest man wrestling with his absurd existence, and out of that struggle, exhorting his son to fear God." Then still others, and this is probably the majority of the kinds of interpreters that we would get excited about, they read the book almost like an apologetic. That means defense. It's an apologetic against trying to find meaning in this world apart from God. There are these skeptics out there, and it's as if this is an apologetic book, a witnessing book, to show them how foolish it is to try to find meaning in this world apart from God. It's like let's look at life in this world apart from God and see that it doesn't work. And seeing that should lead us back to God, because he's the only one who can help us make sense of life. One of the keys to the whole book, I'm convinced, is the phrase "under the sun." Chapter 1, verse 3, Ecclesiastes 1:3. "What does man gain by all his toil, at which he toils under the sun?" Then again, 1 verse 13. "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with." Obviously, that is a strange phrase, under the sun, because what is over the sun? But the point, I think, is that it is a hint that for much of the book, Solomon is looking at life in this world as it is. Almost, you might say, from our perspective as people after it's been cursed, those who are living under the sun, and he's trying to understand what is the purpose of life. Now, in our next video, we're going to see at the very beginning, he is up front about one of his most important conclusions. But come back for that. Ecclesiastes, a book written to help you understand the meaning of life in a broken world. How do we live life in a world that is so obviously fallen, and in a world where, honestly, a lot of things don't make much sense?